Greetings fellow gamers, this is darkfireslide, and in this video I'm going to be responding to a video by the channel Shadiversity entitled Why Character Levels in RPGs Are Stupid. Shadiversity is a channel dedicated to discussion of historical and especially medieval equipment, with the occasional video delving into topics apart from the normal Middle Ages content. Before I begin my rebuttal to Shad's video, I highly suggest that you watch the original video first and then watch this response. I have a disclaimer before I begin, however, that I want to say before we get rolling here. I really enjoy Shad's content. He, along with other historical channels like Lindy Beige and Metatron, are highlights for me on YouTube when it comes to learning about activities I may never be able to afford to actually do. And I really enjoy learning historical facts like weapon techniques, since I love the Middle Ages, and yes, I do mean the actual Middle Ages, you know, blood, war, and all, especially when it comes to weapons and their functionality. Hence my love of games like the Stalker series, which I currently am on and will showcase later, and other low fantasy RPGs such as the Mount and Blade series, especially a Warband, alongside games such as War Thunder and World of Tanks, which allow me to essentially play with wartime equipment like toys that I may never be able to actually afford to use myself. Without these channels, I would probably be a longbow and katana fanboy like a good portion of the internet at large. That being said, and understanding that Shad is very well-meaning in his video, here are my criticisms. My contentions with Shad's video are threefold. For one, and most importantly, Shad does not mention the relation between game mechanics, setting, and narrative that determines what mechanics in a role-playing game should have. In any RPG, the mechanics should totally match what is happening in the narrative. If the game's premise is that you are the hero of a long-lost prophecy in a world full of magic and dragons, it makes sense that you should be an extremely powerful badass, or at the very least, can become one. Second, he appears to only mention games in the veins of World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, and Dungeons & Dragons. In each of these games, I will discuss the importance of the narrative and the game mechanics, as well as point out some holes in Shad's argument, especially regarding the knife to the neck scenario and how more traditional role-playing games handle this subject, and I'll talk about grinding as well. Finally, I will discuss games such as Stalker, which, again, will show up later, and I will discuss one of the most important concepts in RPGs, progression, and show that even more realistic role-playing games should still have a sense of progression to ensure the player feels growth alongside their character in terms of the narrative. Role-playing games are about a few common subjects and generally employ two major concepts in their construction. A, that the player plays a role in a scenario, given, and B, that the role played is typically either as the protagonist, such as the classic BioWare setup, or as part of a larger team that is functionally a singular character, a la a typical Dungeons & Dragons setup. Like a proper story, characters and the players who play those characters are a part of a narrative, though the importance of the narrative varies from game to game. Compare Planescape Torment to Skyrim, for example. However, as a character in a story, the player should progress in order to make the game dynamic and give the player increasing strength as they continue to learn the game's mechanics. A classic example of this is in Dungeons & Dragons. Characters often start with generic weapons and equipment. This is done intentionally. Even for experienced players, at level 1 in D&D you have a limited framework to use your character in combat, while you learn the intricacies of whichever class you chose, and as a new player, it gives you the chance to learn how to actually roleplay, you know, with things such as having conversations, investigation, or doing anything other than combat, so that you don't get too bogged down in the actual mechanics of the game while you continue to learn your actual character. As you gain levels fighting things and completing quests and doing story things, you gain more abilities as your character's improving skills are abstracted through more hit points, damage, and other abilities. The main reason that I mention this is that Shad seemed to deviate from the idea that RPG mechanics aren't realistic, and instead began to say that RPG mechanics don't really work and that they're, well, broken. While this is his opinion, I still feel that there are multiple ways in which this opinion can be refuted. This brings me to my first point. The relation between an RPG's leveling mechanics is integral to the narrative, or at least should be. To broadly generalize, the relative power level in game mechanics should in some way resemble the narrative the game is attempting to tell. In a fantasy setting, humanoid characters often end up fighting things that are unimaginably powerful compared to what a human in real life could ever hope to achieve. Dragons the size of a building or larger prowl mountainsides, and terrible monstrosities lie in deep, dark, forgotten places. Things any normal human would be insane to fight. But that's the point. Our characters aren't normal humans. They're heroes. Dungeons & Dragons in particular promotes the idea that, even from humble beginnings, that humans can eventually overcome great and terrible foes no ordinary human or even soldier could hope to achieve. That is why it is fantasy. It is far beyond the realm of what is physically possible. This dynamic is important to understanding why leveling up exists in the first place. The best example of this I can think of is, of course, The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, while it is not explicitly stated, the characters do sort of level up over time. The Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and hobbits of the Fellowship of the Ring are much weaker than the characters we see by the Return of the King. This is because they are battle-hardened, having gone through many dangers and survived and learned from those encounters. This is true of real people as well. Experienced soldiers and fighters can often overcome situations, and often do overcome situations, that less experienced people simply fail at, or even run from. This is an important part of the narrative, especially for the hobbits in Lord of the Rings, that, despite being short and otherwise fairly normal, through bravery and experience they become competent, crafty fighters. Add this to their increasing stockpile of new magical arms and armor, such as Frodo's mithril shirt and his magical sword Sting, or Anduril for Aragorn, and we can see that the characters are rewarded with equipment to match their new level of experience. This is the kind of progression that is important to narratives, and of course, to role-playing games themselves. This brings me to my second point, and in this section I'm going to reference 3 archetypal game types that Shad is more or less referring to in his video. The MMO, with World of Warcraft as an example, the Japanese role-playing game, or JRPG for short, with Final Fantasy as an example, and finally the classical Western RPG with Dungeons & Dragons as an example. I'll mostly be referring to version 3.5 since it's the one I'm most familiar with. But let's start with World of Warcraft. In the video, Shad seems to have some issues with the way that the endgame content works, as well as the idea that characters have tens of thousands of hit points, perhaps being over 100 or even 1,000 times better than their level 1 selves. From a realism standpoint, yes, this is a fairly ridiculous concept. In no world could a human being ever get strong enough that he could get stabbed 100 or 1,000 more times than he could from his starting point. But let's step back and examine the role of leveling in a game like World of Warcraft that requires an unhealthy amount of grinding, strangely similar to JRPGs, to achieve a certain status. World of Warcraft is, at its core, a game that revolves around teamwork and cooperation between several moving parts of a team in order to achieve a goal. Higher level dungeons and raids in World of Warcraft are, for the most part, literally impossible to complete by yourself. You need a team, and you will play a role in that team, hence the term role-playing game in a literal sense. Much like Dungeons & Dragons, the role of leveling in World of Warcraft is a means to show how much time the character has spent training and how much real-world experience they have. Unlike D&D, however, this often results in fighting the same enemies over and over again to achieve the maximum level, and then doing the same thing over and over again just for a chance at getting better gear. However, as you level, you continue to fight tougher and more epic enemies. At the start of World of Warcraft, you fight things like spiders and boars, but by the end you are killing literal gods or characters or beings with godlike powers, by working together as a part of a team with other legendary heroes at that point. Grinding is important in World of Warcraft because it forces a player to practice their abilities, and spend a great deal of time getting familiar with those abilities. From a real-world perspective, this is the same as learning all the various ways one might cut with a broadsword, bastard sword, axe, or whatever weapon suits your fancy, while also learning things like footwork and how to use your armor. Repetition tempered with real-world experience helps both real-world fighters and players make their movesets second nature. I can guarantee that a high-level World of Warcraft character with 50 abilities to manage is just as complicated as learning the staggering number of steps required to be an effective HEMA fighter. The next kind of game that Shad more or less refers to offhand is the classic Japanese role-playing game. The best example of this kind of game is the Final Fantasy series, where the premise is quite simple. There are bad guys trying to take over or destroy the world, and your ragtag team of usually orphans needs to stop them. There are many parallels to MMOs that JRPGs share. Often there are different classes and different purposes working as a team. Grinding helps to teach the player what each character's abilities are and helps you test them in non-lethal environments. And finally, level is used to show characters' progress at a glance to help them fight against increasingly deadly enemies. In particular, Shad's gripe with this genre is that grinding is repetitive and boring, and that killing the same thing over and over again doesn't necessarily indicate that someone will be stronger or harder to kill just because they did that. However, I would compare this to the idea of sparring and real combat. Again, people get better at fighting through practice and experience, but one classic theme of stories is the idea that training is boring but necessary. Movies like The Karate Kid are a prime example of this. Doing the repetitive, boring thing can lead to great skill and strength later, and I'm sure that this is absolutely true when learning real sword techniques and footwork, that it sometimes seems boring and repetitive, but ultimately it is necessary to be an effective fighter. And now, our third point, we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. The example that Shad gave about someone getting stabbed in the neck and not dying is, you know, at the core of this subject. Well, for this case, I have two examples from two different game systems that are contrary to what Shad is saying. We'll start with Dungeons & Dragons and then move on to Shadowrun. In Dungeons & Dragons, the game relies on a percentage-based hit chance system, where a hit with a weapon does a certain amount of damage that, level for level, is carefully proportioned to do a certain percentage of the enemy's hit points. This ensures that combats at all levels feel like a back-and-forth exchange that you might see in a movie and in real life, with two fighters parrying, sidestepping, throwing swings that don't manage to penetrate the enemy's armor. One conception of D&D is that each hit is a literal hit to someone's person. However, I think this conception is simply incorrect. Hits and hit points in D&D are meant to represent things such as fatigue and the idea that a character is starting to slip. The only hits which are actually hits are critical hits, or the final blow that finally knocks a character unconscious. If a fighter has 60 hit points, for example, and gets hit by an archer for 8 points of damage, what likely happened in a real scenario is that the force of the arrow hit the fighter's armor with such force that it staggered him, but didn't leave anything other than a nasty bruise. If that same archer got a critical hit for 20 points of damage, what may have happened instead is that the arrow actually penetrated the fighter's armor in a non-vital area, hitting him right between his, intestines or something. But, it still hurts enough that the fighter is going to need several days of rest or the help of healing, magic in order to recover from such a grievous wound. Another take on this idea is in the Shadowrun RPG system. Shadowrun is a cyberpunk futuristic gritty RPG, tabletop game where characters don't ever really get all that much tougher. Instead, they have to upgrade and augment themselves and buy better equipment in order to gain progress. This is why they go on shadow runs and steal things and do other kinds of, shady jobs to get money in order to get better at shadow running. It's a kind of a self-serving thing. However, in Shadowrun, there are many, many ways to die, and even for a highly progressed or actualized character, something like a grenade headshot or a building collapsing on top of them will likely kill them, with their only saving grace being a pool of finite edge points a character can tap into to cheat death. In both of these systems, combat is abstracted for the sake of playability. Too much complication makes the game take longer to play, and it makes it more difficult and tedious as well. And now, let's finally answer the question of the knife to the neck. The reason that I gave D&D as an example is because most hits in D&D are not lethal. This is explained by the game mechanics and by our own conception of it. Much like a real fight, characters are constantly moving, ducking, and weaving, making lethal attacks quite difficult. However, in D&D there exists a mechanic called the coup de grace, wherein an attack is made against an helpless opponent, who, basically asleep, paralyzed, stunned, etc. This attack is automatically a critical hit, so tying into the idea that a critical hit is an actual hit. And the victim of this attack must make a save equal to the amount of damage taken, or immediately die regardless of their remaining hit points. So this would be your functional knife to the neck, but you can only really do it when your opponent is completely helpless. Otherwise, it's going to take a great deal of effort to actually accomplish this. And the other thing is, even high-level characters can really struggle to make this sort of save, simply because the difficulty of it is based on the amount of damage taken, and at higher levels, the amount of damage taken may just simply be impossible for a character to make, barring the roll of a natural 20 on the 20-sided die, for example. Alright, now I'm going to talk about the final point that I wanted to make, and that is that progression is an important part of role-playing games, even if they are meant to be difficult or realistic. Now, you wouldn't know it just by looking at this game, Stalker, but it's actually more role-playing game than first-person shooter. It has an interesting setting, a science fiction version of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster, where there are mutant horrors and angry Russians scattered throughout the landscape. There are various different factions the player can interact with, each of whom has a different goal, and a different way of achieving those goals. Like other role-playing games, you receive tasks from non-player characters through conversation that, when completed, give you more resources to work with. All this being said, the Stalker series is a highly lethal experience that requires both skill and tactics to survive. The player in Stalker needs to learn how to do various things. He needs to learn how to aim well and conserve ammunition, because he can only carry so much, and it is a realistic load. Now, it is about 50 to 60 kilograms on average, or about 120 to 140 pounds. He must think to ambush his enemies with his firearms, and he must decide whether he needs to use armor-piercing ammunition or standard full metal jacket ammunition. He must also know how to traverse fields of dangerous, radioactive anomalies to procure precious artifacts, which he can then use for his own benefit or sell for a generous amount of money. He must maintain his weapons and body armor to ensure that they both function properly. Finally, a stalker must be prepared to treat himself for radiation, burns, and bleeding caused by claws, bullets, and explosions by having medical kits, admittedly an abstracted concept, bandages, radiation pills, food, alcohol for curing radiation, and even pills for protection against psionic attacks. Death is a common occurrence for a stalker, especially those unprepared for their current situation. Most important to note, however, is that in Stalker, the player character's health never increases, but progression is still an extremely important and integral part of the experience. The character in Stalker starts with next to nothing. A mere low-caliber pistol, a few hundred rubles to his name, which is, amounts to about $10, and little to no body armor for protection against bullets, claws, radiation, or radioactive anomalies. Death comes quickly to starting Stalkers because they cannot afford the protection that they need for the zone. But, to make money, a Stalker must do risky tasks such as carefully navigating radiation fields, killing mutant animals, and fighting off other Stalkers or bandits. By doing these dangerous things, a Stalker earns money that he can use to better purchase Kevlar and weapons, and then rely upon a technician to then upgrade those Kevlar and weapons with better protection and gun handling characteristics. Thus, while the character's total hit points never increase, it is still extremely useful to have better protection to help prolong a Stalker's health in a firefight, or while standing too close to a scalding geyser. A similar situation exists in the Mount and Blade series of games. The character in this low-fantasy medieval RPG starts with hardly any money, basically a butter knife, and armor that can't stop the butter knife that the character starts with. However, the character progresses by hiring villagers from local towns to help fight against bandits, whose equipment can be sold to raise more soldiers or purchase better equipment. A character levels up in Mount and Blade and even gains more hit points, but never enough that a character can be invincible in the same way that you can in some other RPGs. And in case I forgot to mention it, you don't actually level up in Stalker. There's no leveling system. It's all based on your equipment and how much you prepare. Now back to Mount and Blade, the character instead learns things like how to be a better leader, how to haggle better, learns better combat tactics and better formations. He can set up troops ahead of time, things of that nature. Or he can even just become a better sword and shield fighter within reason. And despite this game's calling as a role-playing game, it still adheres to principles that wouldn't be out of place in the real world or even a slightly fictionalized version of our world. A role-playing game that has no progression quickly becomes bland and unenjoyable. Role-playing games with high lethality, such as the Fire Emblem franchise, which I haven't even mentioned, need to be tempered by giving the players ways to adequately prepare for increasingly dangerous situations as the narrative progresses. Most games deal with these concepts in an abstract way, and others do so more pragmatically. Progression is one of, if not the most important concepts in role-playing games that makes them both strong in storytelling and fun and engaging to actually play. Game mechanics exist to account for the many variations in a situation in real life, including success and failure on actions that seem either ridiculously easy or stupidly hard, either due to dice rolls or to intelligent play on the part of the players in question. In closing, I want to make one final point about role-playing games and video games in general. At the moment, I think we are still a far cry from being able to imitate real life when it comes to the types of narratives that exist even in realistic role-playing games. We should instead focus on how effectively a medium conveys its ideas, and judge them on how effectively those ideas are conveyed. Games rely on cooperation between the narrative and the experience the player has with the game mechanics, and it's important to understand this relationship when talking about how role-playing game mechanics work. Without any sort of progression in storytelling, role-playing games stop being role-playing games, and instead become things like strategy, shooter, or simulation. And this is why leveling up or otherwise progressing is justified in RPGs. It is a tangible way to gauge the strength of a character at a glance in a way that is easy to understand and clearly visible. Realistic or not, progression is a core part of the role-playing experience, and doing away with it entirely would be to rip out a part of its soul, or perhaps its spine. At any rate, I hope I presented this argument in an interesting way and maybe changed your mind, or at least got people thinking. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like. If you like semi-realistic or historical games, such as Europa Universalis 4 or Stalker, be sure to subscribe for guides, let's plays, and discussion videos. Until next time, Godspeed, you brave souls, and I'll see you on the next one.